So to get us started, please welcome Stacey Abrams, the Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair for Race and Black Politics at Howard University, the former Georgia House Minority Leader candidate for governor, and IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow. Secretary Gina Raimondo, former governor of Rhode Island, the 40th Secretary of the Commerce Department, and a staunch advocate on behalf of women and economic prosperity. And our moderator, Professor Olatunde Johnson, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, 59, Professor of Law, Columbia Law School, and IGP-affiliated faculty. These are just three of the extraordinary people we're going to hear from this afternoon. Please welcome them.
So thank you, and welcome everybody. So this panel is entitled Women Empowering Women Through the Economy, and we've already queued up issues around some of the gaps that remain, economic gaps, but also the role of women in various powerful positions and their ability to shape public policy in a way that addresses those gaps. So I'm a lawyer. I think what I think of the most are courts and legislation, but you'll see a theme really running through this panel about another part of law and policy, which is really thinking about the ways in which you can have federal policy, state and local policy be shaped in a way that actually advances equality, right? So you can call them equality directives. So I'm going to say very little. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to really talk about some of the promising initiatives. And I think again, you'll see this theme. We'll start with what happens at the federal level, but then really move on to the ways in which at the state and local level we can take some of these federal initiatives, supplement them, and think about them in new ways. So I was going to start with the secretary. So since the beginning of the administration, there has really been a lot of new federal programs, and I'd say new money being poured into the economy through things like the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS and Science Act. We'll explain some of these acronyms as we go along, the Inflation Reduction Act. And so one challenge is, how do you make those and shape those in a way that works for women and for people of color? A kind of idea around some of federal programs, like New Deal programs, for instance, is that they shaped the economy in a male model and a white model. You've been trying to disrupt that in various ways. So I wondered if you could say how these programs are being transformed and working for women and people of color.
Well, thank you. Hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. As we were waiting, I could kind of feel the energy in the room, and this is one of my favorite topics. My view is if you put women in charge of everything, everything will be better. So I'm very excited to be here with my pal, Stacey. We met in law school a long time ago. So let me say this. President Biden's leadership is nothing short of extraordinary. And because of that, we have, as you say, about $1 trillion that we're in the process of investing in America, in the economy, in communities, which will create, hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million plus, good-paying jobs. I'm investing money to stimulate semiconductor manufacturing facilities in the United States. That's the CHIPS Act. The Infrastructure Act, you see it everywhere you go, new roads, bridges, laying broadband, et cetera. And that's amazing, right? It's gonna level the playing field, provide opportunity for all Americans. But it only works if we make sure everybody benefits equally. So I'll give you one example. In the process of putting the money out the door for the CHIPS facilities, I have said, if you're going to get taxpayer money, XYZ big company, tell me what your child care plan is. I want to know, right? If you're going to get, pick $1 billion of taxpayer money, I want to make sure women have an opportunity to get a job in those facilities. And that won't happen if you don't have a child care plan. Now, when I did that, a lot of Republicans in the Congress said, well, Secretary, you're introducing social policy in a national security program. And I said, I don't agree with that. This is hard-nosed economics. There's a labor shortage. These companies need to be competitive. They need the best workers, and that means women. And you're not going to get them if you don't think about childcare. You talked about the building trades. Right now, the percent of women in the building trades is the same as it was 50 years ago. And depending on the trade, it's somewhere between 2% and 7%. Why does that matter? Why does it matter that we don't have enough women who are welders, pipe fitters, plumbers, et cetera? Because they pay $60, $70, $80 an hour with benefits. So I launched an initiative called 1 Million Women in Construction. Right now, there's 1 million women in construction in this country. I said, let's double it. It was very scientific. And then we have this, let's double it. But I'm working, once again, we're giving huge subsidies to these companies. So we're working with labor unions to have apprenticeship initiatives for women, working with these companies, think about attracting and recruiting women. If you go to a job site right now, let's say I went to a job site right now as a welder, and I needed a harness, chances are there's only size extra large or large harnesses on the job. That's dangerous. There's not a women's bathroom. There's one porta-john. This is like straight out of the 50s. So anyway, I'll stop there. But you can tell I've got some passion on the topic. That's why it matters who's making policy and who's putting the money out the door. Because, I have all this money to invest, and I'll be damned if half the jobs don't go to women.
I think it's important to think about this as, if the money is going out the door, that it should be justified as at least half of it going to women. And if you don't do that through affirmative policy, I don't think it really gets done. I wanted to follow up, though, on more granularly what it looks like for change to happen in this direction. And I want to ask about the child care piece, but actually first, since the last thing you left with was the building trades, I mean, it's been a long-standing problem trying to diversify the construction trades. So on the gender front and even on race ethnicity, and there's some of the lowest participation rates. It surprises people. And even some of the workers who are slightly overrepresented, like Latino workers, tend to be in the most unsafe, ununionized, lowest paying jobs. But I want to ask, we could have had Leader Abrams here for so many different reasons, including working on voting rights issues, but this is on women in the economy. What are your thoughts in terms of the construction trades and EOC, and is there, how do we actually make progress on that, given this recent EOC report that shows what the big gap is still in terms of employment?
So I'm going to actually link it to something you said at the very beginning of this question, which is that it takes an affirmative, I'm going to be more specific, an affirmative action perhaps, but not to create too querulous a conversation. But what we're talking about is how we have the lived experience of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it has become a bit of a pejorative. And I want to point to the secretary who just said, it is an economic issue. Since the inception of this country, we have had a series of movements that have been designed to guarantee that we diversify who gets access to the American dream and that they get included in participation. So when we think about we think about Reconstruction, you think about the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, the women's rights movement, LGBTQ+ movement, disability movement, Chicano movement, name a movement in the United States. It has all been about how do you get access to the American dream? And in getting that access, how do we make certain that we are diversifying participation? And so I want us to reclaim the right, much as the secretary said. We have the right to half the economy. We have the right to participation fully in every facet of this economy, and that includes the building trades. When I was in the state legislature, a lot of my work was actually around defending access to those jobs that were being created. And one of the many jobs I have, I'm kind of like a terrible joke. I have lots of different jobs in lots of different spaces, but one of them is working with an organization called Rewiring America. We have $858 billion, billion with a B, moving through the economy to electrify residential spaces. Basically, that means induction stoves, heat pump water heaters, heat pump HVAC systems. Someone's got to install them. It's 121 million households that will need these pieces of equipment. Right now, we are missing 1.4 million people in the workforce to install this equipment. Of that 1.4 million, 700,000 should be women. We live in those houses. We turn on that thermostat. We are the ones using that equipment. Why shouldn't we be the ones installing it? And so the work that I'm doing with Rewiring is thinking about how do we ensure not only that the money gets to the households, but that the people installing the equipment look like the people in those households, that they're women, that they're people of color. And that means providing access to training. That means providing access to how the dollars actually move. Because one of the things we know is the strongest impediment to women and people of color entering different postures in the economy is they simply don't know where the door is. They want the pathway, they will do the work, they just don't know the secret knock, if they can find the door, if they know where the building is. And so part of the opportunity is having a secretary like Secretary Raimondo who is saying, I'm going to hold the person with the purse strings accountable for welcoming you in, but we also have the responsibility when we're hiring someone to come and install our newly funded heat pump to ask, do you have women who work with you? Let me see what your workforce looks like. Part of our opportunity as individuals is to ask the questions of who's providing our service. But most of the time we get so wrapped up in trying to get it done fast that we forget that we are also the purveyors of this opportunity. And so I think about it always in this way. Where is the money coming from? Who is it going to? And who does it touch along the way? And as we think about the building trades, every one of those buildings will likely house either a family or a business. Which businesses are going into those buildings? Who's doing the construction? Who is doing the financial services, managing those loans? Who's doing those pieces? And at each of those junctures, we need to look at who gets to touch the dollar. If we do that, that is DEI in practice. We're not saying you can't touch it. We're just saying let's make sure that the different hands that are engaged look like the people that live in this country.
Yeah, and I agree.
So from what you're saying, it seems that part of it is about attaching requirements to funding programs. Part of it might be gathering data so that we're actually monitoring. It sounds like you maybe also were alluding to the idea of partnerships, funding partnerships that help with things like training. Before asking a different question of the secretary, I wanted to ask more about the childcare piece, given that there are programs like CHIPS that are now requiring that. Is there a role for states and localities in that? What does that look like to you?
Absolutely. And you keep saying lots of smart things at once, so I have to keep pulling them out.
The question with three parts is my hazard of my job.
It is.
Sorry.
We're all afflicted lawyers. Yeah. We have this. Requirements are a part of every dollar that comes from the public space. There is not a single dollar that gets led without there being a requirement. But as the secretary pointed out, we only have a question about the dollar when it seems to affect someone other than who we expect. Mm-hmm. So when she said she was looking at childcare, it was couched as a social program. But we put requirements on dollars, public dollars, every single day. We would not have a Congress if we did not put requirements on every dollar. The question is, why do we value less the requirements that do the most? And when it comes to childcare at the state level, that is absolutely an issue. Because at the state and local level, that is where people are making the toughest decisions. I live in a state where the minimum wage remains, the official minimum wage is still $5.15 an hour.
Oh my God.
And before people say, well, the federal wage covers it. It doesn't cover certain household workers. It doesn't cover certain agricultural workers. I live in a state with a lot of agricultural workers and a lot of childcare workers and a lot of folks who are not entitled to the federal minimum wage. And so it matters that companies have policies that require that childcare be provided, because those childcare providers have access. Is Ai-jen Poo in the audience? She may not be here
She'll
yet.
on the next panel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ai-jen will talk about this even more.
Yeah.
In fact, she's going to be even better, so just forget everything I've said and just listen to her. But we know that at the state level, especially for women of color and for poor women, access to childcare is the difference between whether you make a living and make a life, whether you are on public assistance, or whether you are independent. If you cannot take care of your child, especially in a state where you are no longer allowed to make the decision of whether you have a child or not. So let's tie all these pieces together. When you lose reproductive freedom, when you lose bodily autonomy, and you are also not entitled to access to childcare, what are the consequences? Those policies matter, and so it matters that you have access to childcare. It matters that you have good paying jobs. It matters that those jobs are being funded by public dollars where you should have a better opportunity to participate in the economy. And we have to think about these things holistically instead of in the silos that we're often told to consider them in, because it's also how we strengthen and grow our economy. We have an extraordinary Commerce Secretary who is saying the way we become a stronger economy, and we have a president who's saying the way we become a stronger nation is if half of our population can actually participate not only in its progress, but in its support and its success.
Yeah, to that point, Stacey said something earlier. You said we have a right to half of these resources or a right to half of these jobs. That's true, but also we will have a better, stronger, more innovative economy if women are fully empowered.
Absolutely.
Right? So I say to people all the time, if you show me an organization or a company or a government office or whatever of all white men, you're showing me an organization that is not as innovative and as effective as it could be, right? Homogeneity is the enemy of innovation. You know it yourselves, and whatever you guys do, if all you do is surround yourself with people who think the same way, you're not going to get the best answer. You're not going to get the best result. If all you have are, people in the building trades or semiconductor engineers or pick your profession, all of the same, you're just not going to have the best people by definition, right? Not the best. So yes, we have a right, but honestly, I also think if we're going to continue to lead the world, Secretary Clinton was just talking about leading the world, and by the way, we are here because you led the way.
Absolutely.
If America's going to lead the world, diversity is truly our strength, but only if we enable everybody to actually have a chance. Just like you said, where to go, how to get the job. If you talk about women, childcare, it's necessary. It's necessary. Why do the building trades matter? I mean, you all know this, but half of the reason women are poorer than men is because women cluster in low-wage industries. Mm-hmm. So if you're a woman without a college degree, chances are you're a domestic worker, home care worker, home health aide, waitress, et cetera, and you're making maybe not $5 an hour, but maybe $10 or $15 an hour. If you're a man without a college degree, you may go into manufacturing or the building trades. And like I said before, average first-year plumber apprentice, depending on where you live in the country, $40 an hour plus health care. So apart from the fact that better homes will be built if you have the best women on the job, you'll lift so many women out of poverty. But but childcare is an enabler, and COVID crushed the childcare industry. At the time COVID came, I was the governor of Rhode Island, and I saw it. All the childcare centers went out of business, and we funded them with federal dollars that came through the state. That has now dried up, and you see them going out of business. So it's these are just real investments, and it's a shame that it gets wrapped up in what is called a social program, because the truth of it is, that's just baloney, right? These are just like smart investments. If you were setting up a company or an industry or an institution, you would never say, I want to exclude half of the labor pool.
Exactly.
I want to exclude half of the brains or creative energy. You'd say, no, how do I figure out how to enable all of it?
I love how you're just mainstreaming it as just inclusive industrial policy. I mean, that's how we should think about this, not that these equality requirements are just sort of floating out over there as an add-on.
Sorry, not to interrupt, but that is my approach. I don't know if it's going to work. It's the story, and I'm sticking to it for now.
Yeah.
But when I was in the thick of negotiating for the CHIPS Act, or I negotiated the broadband part of the infrastructure bill. At the same time, we were working shoulder to shoulder with Ajahn and others to try to get the president's care economy investments in there, which I thought was necessary. So I was on the phone with lots of senators, including Democrats, mostly male, who would say, hey, Secretary, I can get with you on the infrastructure, I can get with you on chips, but I'm not getting with you on the social programs. And I'd say, what do you mean the social programs? And they'd say, all those investments in the care economy, in child care, in home care. And I said, they're not social programs. And often, some of them, who shall go nameless, Democrats, men, would say, those are the women's issues. Mm-hmm. I can get with you, Secretary, on semiconductors, and I can get with you on infrastructure, but not the women's issues. So for me, I've concluded, right or wrong, as long as these investments are viewed as women's issues or social issues, we are not going to get them done. So that's why I think they're just plain old economic issues.
Absolutely.
And everybody ought to care the same. And that's, when you say mainstream, that little light bulb went off for me. They're not women's issues, because if you think they are, they're going to hit the cutting room floor.
Well, you just mentioned broadband, and I wanted to ask you both about that. I think we still use the term digital divide, but it always sounds so old-fashioned to me. But broadband is important. It's a kind of infrastructure for connection that's as important as brick and mortar transit infrastructure. There are wide regional disparities in who has access to high-quality broadband. It has a lot of effects on people's ability to participate in the economy. Certainly, COVID really illustrated to us how many effects it had for all sorts of social services, since everything is accessed, education, et cetera, through broadband. And then there are racial and gender disparities in who has access to it. So I wanted to ask you both about broadband and the digital divide. And maybe I'll start with you, Leader Abrams, and then we'll find out what's happening on the federal level.
I mean, they're linked together. So I live in Georgia, and across the South, and actually in a lot of parts of the country, we still have digital inequity. And this is particularly pernicious for women. Because right now there has been a devaluation and a devolution away from call centers. So if you need help and you try to get someone, you're told to go to the website. If you don't have the internet, you're basically told you're on your own. We try to solve healthcare issues in rural communities that are losing hospitals, or in communities that refuse to expand Medicaid still. And you're told telehealth. Well, you can't do telehealth if you can't get on the internet. And so we have these hardened social issues, and I use social with a small s. You have these hardened issues of access that are exacerbated by the lack of access to the internet. And so broadband, we have been talking about this for 20 years. There's been money for about 10 of those years. The challenge is that once it gets to the state level, it depends on whether or not the state wants to solve the problem and where they choose to solve it. There is inequity in the distribution of dollars. There's an equity in the investment in community. And so we have to be incredibly intentional about following our public dollars all the way down. And right now what happens is we get a fantastic federal program, and I give such credit to the Biden administration and in every component of it, trying to do the best it can. The challenge is that we have 50 different states with 50 different beliefs about who should have access. But poverty doesn't care. Being isolated doesn't care. Being disconnected does not care who your governor or your state legislature is. And so for me, the question of digital equity is a question of access. Let's talk about, if we want more women who are building semiconductors, more women who are in the building trades, right now you can, if you're in the right part of the country, you can possibly go to a center to learn. You can go through an apprenticeship program, but a lot of training is online. If you don't have access to online learning, you are disconnected from substantial components of the economy. And it becomes this horrific cycle where digital inequity basically not only, it no longer paralyzes you, it actually forces you backwards. And so it becomes even more imperative that we do this work, that we close not just the digital divide, but that we acknowledge that digital inequity is dangerous for our country. And I'm going to turn it over to the person who knows a lot more about that. You can say why.
Thank you. So first of all, for the students in here or anyone wondering what to do with a career, or does it matter, can you make a difference by going into government? The answer is absolutely yes. And let me give you one concrete example, picking up on what Stacey just said. This is real for me right now. So in the infrastructure bill, the Commerce Department received just about $50 billion to invest with and through states to make sure every American has high-speed, affordable internet. So we're doing that now. And we have a big debate, which ultimately I will have to decide and solve this as one policy decision, which is what is affordable. You know, cable companies think $200 a month is affordable. I don't. Lots of people you talk to in the rural South in particular will say they have the internet now, they have satellite service, it's $150 a month, but during a storm or wind, it goes down. I don't think that's affordable. So I, right at this very moment, have lots of smart people, maybe some Columbia Law School grads, thinking through how do we define affordable that stands up in court, that is truly affordable, which, by the way, for some families is nothing per month, right? If it's a basic utility. So that's anyone who's interested to come work with me at the Commerce Department to solve these issues that helps bring people out of poverty. It matters to have great people who care. The way we're trying to do this is state by state. So I've set the program up so that every state, every governor has to show us a plan for their state. Because wiring everybody in Georgia is a different challenge than in, say, Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, where I'm from, technically everyone has the access to the internet because there's no really rural areas. It's just very expensive. Or maybe you live in an assisted living high-rise and your particular apartment building isn't wired. That's very different than Alaska, New Mexico, or Georgia. So we've decided we're requiring every governor to give us their plan, and we're not going to give them any money until we approve of their plan. And some governors don't love that because we haven't yet approved their plan and they haven't yet received their money. But they'll get it as soon as they satisfy us that everybody, can have the internet. But the truth of it is, the digital divide, you say, sounds old-fashioned, but in the era of artificial intelligence, it just puts the digital divide on steroids. Mm-hmm. Like a young kid who is home and trying to learn and doesn't have the internet and doesn't have a computer is really so behind. And now all of his friends are going to learn about AI, and he or she is going to get further behind. Or like I was in rural South Carolina. I talked to a man in his 80s, and he just started weeping because he told me his wife died. They lived in rural South Carolina. The closest hospital was an hour away. The doctor offered telehealth, but he didn't have the internet. Yeah. So he didn't get telehealth, and she died. And I was there at a broadband event, and he said to me, please let everyone know about this. She should be alive. If we had done those telehealth visits, she may have lived. So Yes, it's education, and we all know the stories of kids in the pandemic in the McDonald's parking lot trying to do their homework, but it's so much more than that. Just think about your daily lives. You probably can't get past breakfast without using the internet, right? Truthfully, everything. And so we, like Americans, you could be the smartest person in your community, the hardest working student in your high school, but you don't stand a chance unless you have the basic infrastructure, including affordable internet. And by the way, Americans don't want handouts. They just want a chance. And that's what we're providing.
Yeah, and I think these issues of digital equity and digital infrastructure may be where we have to end. So you've really helped set up what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day. So I'm really grateful to you. I'm already getting the hook that says that we have to wrap up. I want to make sure that there isn't one last thought you want to leave the audience with, but I also want to let everyone know that we're going to dig into these issues as the evening goes on.
Well, I heard tell that there was some conversation about algorithmic bias.
I wanted to sneak in this question about algorithmic discrimination.
Which matters, because as the Secretary pointed out, AI is not going away, and it is becoming an increasingly important part of our lived existence. And if there is bias and discrimination in the data models and the large language models, if there are AI hallucinations that are grounded in misinformation, bad in, bad out. Only it is a much more complicated bad out. And so for women in particular, and women of color especially, we have to also think about how are we connecting all of these conversations to what's to come. We should not be afraid of generative AI. We should not be afraid of artificial intelligence. But we should be aware and we should be wary. And when you are wary, you start to think about what could work, what doesn't work, what might work. But it also means we need to make sure that people who share our values, meaning women who care about the world, are making those decisions too. And right now, we don't know who is actually building this. But I'm willing to bet money I don't have that it's not women. And so we have to think about how are we also growing our capacity for this next generation. All of these are of a piece, and we cannot pretend, and this goes back to Secretary Clinton's point, these are human rights issues, these are economic issues, these are world issues. Women's issues touch everything, and we cannot presume that there is any facet of our lives where having women at the table making decisions and making the choice to do better doesn't change everything for us.
Hear to that. I would simply say, and I think this every day, looking around the world today, for me, it is hard to escape the conclusion that the world would be a better place if more women were in charge. Leading countries, leading companies, leading AI companies, leading at the highest level of every profession. Like, it's not going well in many ways. And I do think if women were running more countries, companies, universities, institutions, it would be better. So as frustrating as this work can be, we have to stay in it. Not really because women deserve to be there, although we do. Because the world will be a much better place. More innovative, more fair, more humane, if we are there. And that's why, as long as we've been doing it, and some of us have been doing it longer than others, we have to stay committed. Because we owe it to one another and to our kids and our grandkids and the rest of the world to make sure women get their fair share of these leadership positions.
Okay, well, with that, thank you. And thank you for translating your leadership into policy. Thank you.